Roger, I'd like to explore this whole idea of deficit-based versus asset-based assumptions about aging. We've talked about Gene Cohn.
Yeah, and what we're doing now is really updating Gene's early idea that we've got to focus on what we can do and less attention on what we can no longer do. Maybe the best example is the speed of processing. Gene was well aware that the science at the turn of the century showed that our brains, as we get older, slow down in a sense. The speed of processing slows down for a number of reasons, and there's not much you can do about that on a permanent basis. But he also said speed isn't the only contest, and I like to say to people that I'm talking to who are retired, I'll say, what's the hurry? So when you slow the process down and have time to use the resources, Gene thought maybe it's because there are more resources. So let's update that. Perfect.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just to back up a step, the ageism, this assumption that if you're old, you're decrepit and you don't have any skills, Gene would point out even makes its way into the scientific community, that scientists will look at evidence, and if they see that younger people behave in one way and older people behave in another way, the immediate assumption is that the younger people are behaving the way they should be.
Better.
They're better, you know, and that the older people are worse. And they follow that line without even considering.
So they're looking for what's better in a definition of the contest, so to speak. So if they would shift that focus to what can be done because you're aging, then that's going to change the whole lens, and it's no longer a contest.
Yeah, yeah. So there's interesting research that sort of is on the borderline of this area. One area is called, one theory is called the crunch theory.
Okay.
And I have to look at the title. Oh yes, it's compensation-related utilization of neural circuits hypothesis.
Okay.
All right. Essentially, what that's saying is that we have redundant circuits in our brain that can compensate if there's a deficit. So the idea is if there's demand that has 4 units of requirement. I mean, it takes 4 units of demand to solve this problem.
By demand, you mean brain demand. You have to okay.
Yeah, I'm making this up.
Yeah.
There's 4 units of something or other, but you need to have that cognitive energy, those cognitive resources to do it. Now, if what they find when they look at young brains and old brains is that younger brains, when they're solving problem, tend to light up on the left, in the left hemisphere.
Okay.
Not so much on the right hemisphere, which is interesting. As you get older, there's more balance in the sense of
there's more bilateral?
Yeah, it's more bilateral. And going back to what we were saying before, it seems like the immediate assumption of the scientists is that, oh, look at that, the older brains are bilateral, they must be not doing as well as the younger brains, which can do it all with their left hemisphere.
And then they would say, how unfortunate that that happens when you age.
Right.
Okay, then what do they find?
Well, what they do, this theory at any rate, is that the brain compensates. That if the left hemisphere has only got 2 resource things because it's not functioning as well, assuming that the older brain is not functioning as well, then it's recruiting something on the right hemisphere.
And that's a theory we've read for years, the recruitment theory, that the brain has this mysterious way of finding a way to get around a problem by recruiting neurons from another side of the brain. And earlier you said that the younger brain will use primarily left, sometimes right, but when both hemispheres are used, it's what Gene Cohn used to say, going from 2 to 4-wheel drive, that's not as fast, but you get there in a smarter way.
Well, that's the point, yeah. Gene was saying, many scientists will say, oh, look, the older brain is struggling.
And that's ageism.
Yeah, oh, definitely ageism. So they're recruiting the right hemisphere and they're getting both sides. Gene said, wait a minute, hold on.
Turn it around.
Yeah, maybe that means that the older brains are actually using more of their brains, that they have more information in there.
I wonder if they tested the kids to see, young brains, to see if they could use both. Maybe they're unable to use both sides and never have been challenged, but as you get older, you have a way to do it that's yet to be discovered.
Yeah, Daniel Kahneman,
Yes.
in his book Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow.
Can you go into that? Go into that.
Yeah, he essentially says that we have two thinking systems, a fast thinking system and a slow thinking system. And we need the fast thinking system because conversation, for example, my brain has to come up with words that flow in a sentence and actually make sense, and it has to come like that. I'm doing an adequate job of it right now, but that has to, you can't think about that too much. I mean, I'm thinking about what I'm saying, but the words have to flow. If you're walking, each step has to come. There are hundreds of different muscle movements that go on. The brain has to do that fast, so there's a whole system to do that. But there's also a slow brain.
And the second system?
Second system that may well be a newer system, more newer in terms of evolutionary development, and probably gets the frontal cortex involved. And it's more of saying, hold on, don't go with your instinct, don't go with your gut reaction. Think about it for a second. So it's slower thinking. That may actually be what's going on with an older brain, because one of the things you've learned, one of the aspects of maturity as you're aging, is that your first response is not always the best response. Younger people, there's a priority on getting the answer out there,
and
getting
moving
it quickly.
to the next challenge.
Yeah, you're moving on. Older people have known, okay, that sometimes gets you into trouble. So you're
and that goes into the be there, done that. I've been there, I've done that. Whereas a younger brain hasn't been there. When they make a snap decision and go on with the next decision making, the error often isn't recognized because of the speed of them moving from one thing to the next. Then they have to spend the time either paying for it or cleaning up the mess. But an older brain, I think Kahneman was naming those a fast system and a slow system, and that they work throughout life, but that only when you get to that point of maturity that your brain can actually utilize that, and especially if we can understand it better, that's something that becomes an asset as you get older.
Right. And then there's just some research that only came out in the last couple of weeks that I've found where they're hypothesizing that the delay, you were talking about the speed of processing, is really time that older, mature minds are taking to look through the memory banks.
To actually go through the Rolodex of
Well,
experience?
yeah, in essence. I mean, that's sort of a dangerous metaphor for memory, but yeah, if you've lived 70 years, you've accumulated just tons and tons of information, and it all gets processed. So when you stimulate a memory, when a younger brain, they'll have 6 things that they associate with it. The older brain will have 6,000 things.
Yes, yes. And people always ask us, how do you remember names and nouns? And I say, those are the 2 N words that really aren't necessarily indicating anything with dementia. And that if you can't remember a name, maybe it's because you have met thousands of people over a lifetime, and hundreds of them you should remember their names. But if you're a 7-year-old kid or even a 14-year-old kid, you may have dozens. So it's that you have more things to go think about. But I really like the slow analyzing of what the choices are and making richer choices. And that often those choices are not wrong. You don't have to clean up the mess that you might have made at a younger day.
Right. So I think the basic point that we're trying to make is that be aware of these ageist attitudes that creep into even things like research, which is supposed to be purely objective. And if you find that somebody is automatically jumping to the idea that an older brain is at a deficit when compared to a younger brain, try and flip it around and see whether it makes sense, that, well, maybe there's actually what you're seeing is an asset there and a benefit.
Well, let me add one thing. When Gene Cohen was working with his ideas of the mature mind, he ran into a study called the Herald study.
Right.
And the Herald study is one that really showed with the imaging machines to prove what Gene had speculated without the imaging machines. And in the early days of imaging, when those studies came out, brilliant thinkers like Gene Cohen would try to connect, and he did. I remember him telling the story about the night that he was online and he heard about a Duke researcher who'd come up with this bilateral thinking theory called Harold, that he emailed him and was surprised that within minutes back he said, Gene, you're right, because Gene asked, does this mean what I think it means? Can you go through the Harold for just...
Yeah, it's hemispheric asymmetry reduction in older adults.
Okay.
Harold, and it's essentially what we've been talking about, that when you look at younger brains and give them a challenge, one hemisphere will tend to light up. And by lighting up, we mean when you're in neuroimaging machine, what they are designed to do is to pick up activity in the neurons. And there's the assumption that the more activity means there's more need to do that, or there's more engagement.
And we've talked in other segments about the recruitment theory, and one of the things that those imaging machines do is it picks up the blood flow of where the brain needs the blood to go, is where you're thinking,
Right.
and that's the whole nature of it. And Gene had always wondered whether or not it's the two sides of the brain that are working in combination. Right. And this study called Harold is the one that proved it, to a point where it's now being looked at as opening up a new chapter in aging and brain research, showing that there are assets because you're using both sides.
Yeah, and you know, the phrase that Gene used that we love to repeat is that what looks like happening is the older brain is working not on just two-wheel drive, but four-wheel drive, engaging both sides of the brain, all of the cognitive resources to solve the problem.
And this, we'll close with this, and that's that this showed Gene that he was right when he said that older and younger brains aren't better or worse, they're just different. And I'll add Betty White's, so let's deal with it. So we'll be back.